Hello, small group leaders. Welcome to chapter 2. You made it. You made it all the way through John chapter 1. I feel like we should have another party. Have you noticed I really just love parties? Just for you guys. Okay, so this week we are going to be talking about Jesus at the wedding of Cana. It's, for many of us, it's a really, really familiar passage. Where he changes the water to wine, and it's just, you're like, oh yeah, Jesus, one of Jesus's first miracles, beginning of his public ministry, yada 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 yada. But here's what we get to do: is we get to take this passage, which for many students, if they've heard it before, it's like, I don't go to weddings, I don't drink wine, I don't see what the big deal is. And to help them see how this really shows us about God's character, who Jesus is, what he cared about, all that sort of thing. So what you're going to try to get your small group to get to is a time in their life whenever they needed help, but they were afraid to ask God because they weren't sure what God was going to do. Because that's what Mary did. Mary asked Jesus for help, not knowing how he was going to fix it, because he hadn't started his public ministry. You know, it's probably, she wasn't necessarily saying like, hey, can you go do your first miracle now? Like, I don't really think that's what was happening, but she trusted him. And it's through that trust that Jesus answered her question, answered her prayer, answered her need. So that's kind of what we're going to bring it back to for your students this week. Is there's a kids movie called Robots, and the whole thing is see a need, fill a need, and like that's the tagline for the whole movie, and that's what I always think of whenever I'm at this passage. Jesus sees our needs, and he is the fulfillment of the needs. And the need in here was not wine, but wine. The wine for the celebration was how he was able to point people to himself as the real fulfillment to their real needs. So, the additional scriptures are, I'm excited about them this week. Psalm 25:1 is one of my favorites. It just says, "In you, O Lord, I trust." That's it. And it seems like such a small and easy thing to say, but it's not. Especially if you have older kids who are thinking about college, especially if you have younger students who have so many things going on in their life that they think that they need to have the answers for, that they think their parents have the answers for, or what have you. Trusting Jesus to A, be the fulfillment of our needs, and B, do it whenever we don't know how God's going to answer that question. I could say, God, I need peace. And instead of just making me feel peaceful, he does something that I was like, whoa, that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant when I asked for peace. But in the end of this story, you know, the master of the banquet says, this is the best wine. This is hands down the best. Jesus blew their expectations. And he does that for us too. What he chooses to do for us is way better than we would choose for ourselves. And that is something that is much easier to see in hindsight. So do share a story from your own life where you wanted God to answer your prayer in this way, but he answered it in that way, and see how, like, no, this was actually hands down the best thing for me. Do that without saying, when you're older, you'll realize. They will, but they're still young, so they don't get it, and then they just feel like you're talking down at them. My phone's falling. Sorry. Oh. Okay. I think probably the biggest, hardest to chew on question for the week is, what is our motivation to listen to Jesus' instructions? why, like, talk about why the servants listened to Mary, and did, because she says the servants just do whatever he tells you to do. And in much of the same way, we really think that, okay, like, if this is what Jesus is telling us as believers to do, what's our motivation for doing that? And for that, I referenced the verse that we're going to come up to later in John, of John 6. And Jesus is giving some hard teaching, and a bunch of people are like, you're asking too much. This is too hard. Following you is too hard. And he looks at his closest disciples and he said, are you going to leave me too? And one of his disciples answered, where would we go? You have the words of life. Like, you are our source of life. And I think that's what we need to get back to. Because I feel like for most of our students, whenever you say, why would you listen to Jesus? They have a lot of moralistic answers, a lot of you should, a lot of answers that have to do with the consequences of not listening to Jesus rather than the benefits of following in Jesus's way. So it's going to be a good week for discussion. I know Jenny told me last week that because we talked about students being squirrely and going off topic, our small group was like, whew, way outside of what we were supposed to be talking about. But it was so good. It was so God-ordained conversation. So if that happened to you, sorry, I don't actually think it's my fault, but I hope that you were able to see the goodness in it too. Yeah, we're also in the series, the Lenten series. Tell your kids that their parents are more than welcome to come and participate in that service that's going to be happening at the exact same time as small group. So we'd love to have their parents come in for that, and then it's a chance for us to get to meet them too. So, good stuff. I'm looking forward to this week with you guys. And know, as always, that you are being prayed over, that you are filled with the Holy Spirit, and that He is going to do a beautiful work in and through you. Thank you so much for your service, for the time that you take out of each week to pour into these students, because you are doing God's kingdom work.